So far, we have described two of the five personality traits: extroversion, which is the sensitivity to positive emotions, and eroticism, which is the sensitivity to negative emotions. Today, we're going to talk about agreeableness, which is a trait linked to the intimate relationships that a person tends to have. Initially, it is important to distinguish it from extroversion. For example, because while an extrovert is motivated to be with people, to talk to people, or expose themselves to them, it is possible that an extrovert has low agreeableness, meaning that they have a good ability to talk and converse with other people, but little tendencies to maintaining these relationships in an intimate and deeper way. This is a very common combination for some types of narcissists, for example. On the other hand, it is also possible to have low extroversion and high agreeableness. Such a person would have a great interest in forming intimate and deeper relationships with other people, but perhaps would not have the necessary social skills for that, or even would prefer to have a few more focused relationships, maybe a one-on-one interaction rather than with several relationships and with several people like an extroverted would. Furthermore, it can be difficult to differentiate people with low agreeableness from those with high neuroticism, since in both cases these people seem to be difficult to relate to in general. The big difference between one and the other is that if you get into an argument and the person starts yelling, cursing, or expressing more emotions than arguments, it is likely that this is a person with high neuroticism. On the other hand, a person with low agreeableness may be more likely to do things that most people are not doing. These are more individualistic people who can often have ideas that go against what is socially expected or what society is doing. But people with high agreeableness are motivated by being pleasant and useful to other people, by being able to live in peace and harmony. People with low agreeableness are more motivated by competition, by fighting, and by having high self-esteem, as if they often seek to be on top of others. When functional, low agreeableness can be obviously a good trait, since competitiveness also brings variability through evolution. For example, imagine that there's an academic environment where people like more to party rather than to study. Due to a social convention, it is more likely that people with higher traits of agreeableness will adapt to do what other people are also doing, while someone with low agreeableness could value more studying by themselves, more because they think that such attitudes are not very appropriate, or sometimes even to be better than others. It is the famous work while they sleep, work while they party, and so on. But of course, this is just an hypothetical case. What we do know for sure is that people with the highest agreeableness scores tend to be women, and those with the lowest scores tend to be men, taking the same distinction as neuroticism. When you think about people who are criminals, who are in prison, who are psychopaths, narcissists, and antisocial, these people have a good tendency to have very low agreeableness because they not only don't care about the bad things that they might happen to them or to others, but because they actually want to hurt other people and they don't care about caring for or respecting them. In the Big Five, there are what are called these facets, which we will talk about someday, maybe. But we can divide agreeableness into two parts. For example, on one side, there is politeness or education, which are people who like to respect the rules, hierarchies, authorities, and norms. And there's also compassion, which are people who have a greater affiliation for empathy, for socialization, for being nice to other people, and for taking care of them. Something interesting is that when we separate conservative people from the right and more liberal people from the left, we see the following distribution. People with high politeness tend to be more on the conservative side, respecting the previously imposed order of things, while those on the left liberal side are more focused on compassion and socialist and community ideals. It makes sense that men tend to be more on the right wing and women more on the left wing as well. That is, unless you live in underdeveloped countries where there seems to be quite a mix. The reason for this is that when we look at first world countries with greater gender equality, income distribution, that is Scandinavia, even the US, or Sweden or Norway, we see that the personality differences between men and women is even greater than in other countries. Women have higher agreeableness in these countries, and men tend to have lower agreeableness. Women prefer health and care fields such as psychology, nursing, while men opt for STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But when we look at the third world countries like China and Malaysia, we see that men tend to have higher levels of agreeableness and they tend to be more feminine, so to speak. And women are more quote-unquote masculine with lower agreeableness traits. But why does this happen? And one of the hypotheses is that when you are in a society that is unequal and people need to compete with themselves, or when they don't see a chance for mobility for them to improve their lives and maybe be like those 20 or 5% who are on the top, people start to adopt traits to get around these cultural differences to allow them to live in society in a more functional way, or at least to try and strive for more. Or in places where these differences don't exist or are very low, people are freer to express their traits, which are inherently biological, hereditary, and genetic. People in these countries are freer to be themselves, in other words. In the brain, the politeness facets are more associated with greater serotonergic functions of serotonin, which regulates a person's emotional stability, and lower levels of testosterone, the male hormone, which, contrary to what people believe, is not something related to aggressiveness or rude behaviors, but is more linked to amplifying already existing traits and behaviors. So, if a person has a tendency to aggressiveness or to be rude, testosterone acts by making that person even more aggressive or even more rude, and not only making him or her have these traits or these behaviors, so to speak. Furthermore, our brain has systems built for empathy. These systems allows us to imitate the feelings of others, and often they are the same systems that makes us feel physical or emotional pain. They are connected between the prefrontal cortex, which regulates morality, and the outer parts of the insula, which regulates our emotional and more impulsive responses. Therefore, even though having a well-developed prefrontal cortex is related to higher intellect, high rationality, and good life decisions, when we see firefighters and people who risk their lives to help others in extremely dangerous situations, such as entering a burning house to save a child, or making impulsive decisions to help someone, we see that it is not these rational parts of the brain that makes us commit these more empathetic actions, but rather these more quote-unquote irrational or more emotional parts of the brain that promote these types of behaviors. And when we look at the compassion subtrait, we see that these empathy systems seem to have greater connectivity and greater activity. And what's cool about these studies that we saw is that they discovered great neuroplasticity in this region, meaning that even if you have a low compassion subtrait, it is possible to train your brain to become even more empathetic. This suggests that even those people who are more rigid and withdrawn can also become more social if they just train and wanted to be that way. And then you might ask, well, why would I want to be more empathetic? And well, When some successful, older or even happier people are asked, what brings you happiness in your life? Most of these people say it was actually friends, family, and relationships that they have created throughout life. Not the objects, not money, not the esteem or the status they created. Even though extroverted people have high dopaminergic motivation, this does not mean that they are happy all the time, and much less happy when they achieve the things that they pursue, as we saw earlier. It is actually the people around us, the ones we choose to be associated with, that promote the most of our happiness, our feelings of satisfaction with life. And this doesn't mean that we need to live for other people, but rather learn to live with other people in a better way. Carl Jung once said that it isn't just because we need oxygen that we were made just to breathe. And at the same time, it isn't just because we need other people that we should not become devoted to them all the time. Individuality is also important, which leads us to see the negative side of having very high agreeableness. And if having extreme aversion to people and society becomes a bad thing, let's now see how having extreme affiliation with other people and society can also become something harmful as well. And when we look at personality disorders, dependent people or dependent personality disorder, we see that the greatest trait that these people present is specifically very high agreeableness. People with this disorder have generalized an excessive need to be taken care of, as if they could not live alone or without someone else supporting them, which makes them become submissive and even start having abusive relationships, as someone with high agreeableness will hardly impose their own will on others and try to disagree with them. It is as if they were devoted to others and would give their lives for them, in extreme cases, of course. These people tend to sacrifice themselves, and they tend to not go against what other people are saying, which can as well not only turn them into becoming submissive, but also agreeing with things that may be in the long term socially doubtful. For example, Nazism, communism, or any other sort of ideology or social ideologies. These are people who are easily seen as dumb or clingy, not because they are actually stupid, but because they have a great attachment to people. And even so, it is possible to use this in a good way. When we see extremely humanitarian people like Mother Teresa, Mahatma Gandhi, or Nelson Mandela, we can imagine how all of these people must have had very high agreeableness. And of course, even Jesus Christ probably had very high traits of agreeableness. And these are people who have managed to reconcile not only their love and compassion for other people, but also know how to use other personality traits which have brought them balance. For now, we can say that if you have low agreeableness, perhaps knowing how to relate better to others and training your empathy could be a good thing to not only achieve greater satisfaction in your life, but as well other things that you cannot even imagine. Research shows that one of the things that make depressed narcissists less depressed is precisely the fact that they do something good for other people. And if you have high agreeableness, it might be a good idea to train your own assertiveness more, to know better how to assert yourself in your relationships so that other people don't take advantage of your willingness to help, or even to use other traits beyond your own very high agreeableness. In short, agreeableness is an ideal trait to have in your life if you're looking for good relationships. People who report having the best relationships and the most satisfaction with those relationships tend to have high agreeableness. And if you are looking to have a good life when you look back, maybe knowing how to have healthy, functional relationships in a good way, and it is the deal. And if you don't know how to do that, maybe the next video on openness to experience may help you how to modulate better new behaviors. See you there.